Hello, dear listener. Before we begin, please set your volume to a gentle level, just soft enough to drift into the background. Now close your eyes, lie still, and let the noise of the day slowly fade away. We are about to begin our quiet journey into sleep. Tonight, I will share with you the first story in our series of calm and uneventful histories, tales made to soothe the mind and guide you into rest. This episode is called The Quiet Patrols of Ming Dynasty Soldiers. If you enjoy these bedtime histories, please give this video a like and subscribe, so you can return every night for new stories that help you fall asleep with ease. Now, let us begin. In the long centuries of the Ming Dynasty, the empire was held together not only by grand palaces, bustling cities, and elaborate rituals at court, but also by the silent and steady work of ordinary soldiers who walked the patrol routes along walls, rivers, and narrow, dusty roads. Their duty was rarely dramatic, and most nights passed without alarm, yet it was precisely this uneventful rhythm that kept the empire secure and allowed farmers, merchants, and travelers to move about their lives without fear. The story of these quiet patrols is not one of sudden battles or heroic duels, but of careful schedules, predictable routines, and the discipline of countless nameless men who move steadily through the dark. Imagine a soldier beginning his shift at dusk. The sun has lowered itself behind the mountains, and the sky has turned a deep shade of violet. He is dressed in a padded cotton uniform, practical more than grand, with a simple belt holding a short sword that is more symbolic than useful on most nights. He picks up a lantern, its small flame trembling behind the thin paper cover, and begins his walk along the low stone wall that borders a sleepy village. His steps are even, his pace unhurried, and the only sounds around him are the distant bark of a dog, the faint creak of bamboo swaying in the wind, and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a passing nightbird. The Ming patrol was part of a larger structure of defense that extended across the empire. While great fortifications such as the Great Wall often capture our imagination, most soldiers were stationed far from such monumental sites. Instead, they worked in smaller posts near rivers that carried grain shipments, near bridges that connected trading roads, and near gates of modest towns, where local officials relied on their presence to deter petty thieves or wandering bandits. Each patrol followed a schedule determined by the drum and bell signals from the guardhouse. When the night drum sounded once, the first watch began. When it sounded twice, the second watch replaced them, and so on until dawn. Soldiers were expected to keep precise time, for any failure to change shifts properly was noted by the officer on duty, and discipline could be harsh for those who neglected their rounds. The patrol itself was simple. 2 or 3 men walked side by side, carrying lanterns, sometimes accompanied by a dog, and followed a prescribed route that rarely changed. They stopped at checkpoints marked by wooden posts or carved stones, where they recorded their presence either by leaving a tally mark or by being observed by another guard. Communication was basic, with wooden clappers or whistles used if trouble appeared. Yet in truth, trouble seldom came. Most nights ended with nothing more than the sound of boots on packed earth and the soft hiss of the lantern flame. Villagers who saw the patrols often barely noticed them, for the soldiers were part of the background of life, as unremarkable as the tolling of the temple bell or the ringing of a blacksmith's hammer. Their constancy made them invisible, and yet it was precisely this constancy that gave peace to those who slept behind wooden doors and paper windows. Life for these soldiers was not glamorous. Pay was modest, often delayed, and rations were simple: rice, millet, and sometimes dried fish or pickled vegetables. Many soldiers inherited their duty from fathers or uncles, for military households were a feature of Ming governance, binding families to service across generations. A son born into such a family could expect to take his place on the patrol line, just as his father had, repeating the same steps night after night, year after year. To imagine their world is to imagine repetition. A soldier tightens his belt, adjusts his lantern, and steps onto the road. He follows the same curve past the same row of houses, notes the same tree leaning over the ditch, and hears the same dogs bark in the same yards. Perhaps he greets the same farmer returning late from the fields, or nods to the same ferryman who secures his boat for the night. These encounters are not exciting, but they are the steady rhythm of life in a vast empire that valued order above all. Occasionally, weather added variety. In winter, soldiers walked with their collars pulled high against the biting wind, their lanterns flickering in snow that gathered along the wall. In summer, they wiped sweat from their foreheads and listened to the constant hum of cicadas. Rain turned the patrol into a march through mud, each step heavy, the lantern dimmed by sheets of water, while in autumn the crisp air carried the smell of harvested grain and wood smoke. The patrol did not pause for seasons. The Empire's security depended on their persistence, and so they walked regardless of weather, health, or mood. Records from local gazetteers describe incidents that were rare but noted with precision. A thief caught sneaking into a granary, a dispute at a ferry crossing that required intervention, a small fire in a stable spotted in time because a patrol happened to pass by. These moments, though minor, were the justification for the endless hours of quiet walking. One never knew when a watchful eye would prevent disaster. And so the patrol continued, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. To us, centuries later, the idea of such quiet patrols may seem dull, but dullness was their very purpose. A night without alarm was a successful night, and an uneventful patrol was a sign that the Empire was safe, the roads were secure, and the people could sleep undisturbed. The Ming state, with its elaborate rituals, bureaucratic records, and complex taxes, depended not only on emperors and scholars, but also on these simple guardians of the dark, whose footsteps formed the unnoticed heartbeat of the night. When we continue to observe the life of these Ming Dynasty patrol soldiers, we find that their days were just as predictable as their nights. A soldier's shift did not begin with excitement or urgency, but with the slow rhythm of preparation, and the process itself was steeped in repetition. At sunset, he would return from his modest barracks where he had spent the afternoon repairing a strap, mending the sole of a worn boot, or helping to gather firewood. The barracks were simple buildings of timber and packed earth, often arranged around a small courtyard where the men could sit and eat their rations. There was little ornament and even less comfort. Straw mats covered the floor, and each soldier kept a small chest or basket for his belongings, which usually consisted of little more than an extra tunic, a bowl, a spoon, and perhaps a charm given by his family. Food was served from large communal pots. The staple was rice or millet porridge, occasionally flavored with green onions or pickled radish if supplies permitted. Once in a while, when a festival approached, dried meat or salted fish would be distributed, and the men would savor it as a rare treat. Wine was sometimes provided in tiny measures, but drunkenness was forbidden and punishable, for clarity of mind was valued even in such routine duties. After the meal, the soldiers would sit quietly, speaking little, sharpening knives that were rarely used, or oiling the simple crossbows that hung in the armory. Crossbows were still issued, though most nights they stayed locked away, taken out only for drills or in the rare chance of trouble. The actual work of the patrol relied less on weapons and more on presence. To see the lantern light moving along the road was often enough to prevent wrongdoing, and so the weapon remained a symbol, while the footsteps and the lantern became the true defense of the Empire. Once the drum beat, the patrol would begin. The guardhouse stood at the edge of the post, and its drum and bell regulated the night like a great clock. Each watch was carefully measured, usually lasting about 2 hours, and soldiers rotated to ensure that no one grew too weary. Officers sometimes walked the rounds to check that the men were not neglecting their duties. And it was said that a soldier found asleep on patrol could face harsh punishment, for negligence was seen as a betrayal not only of the post, but of the emperor himself. Yet despite the threat of punishment, drowsiness was a constant struggle. The human body is not made to walk endlessly through the night, and many soldiers fought to keep their eyes open. Some chewed bitter tea leaves to stay awake. Others hummed quietly, while some tapped their lantern poles against the stones with a steady rhythm. The monotony was both the burden and the essence of the task. It demanded not courage in the face of danger, but endurance in the face of tedium. Villagers who lived nearby grew used to this sight. Children, before falling asleep, sometimes peeked through paper windows to catch a glimpse of the lantern passing. For them, it was as ordinary as the phases of the moon. Farmers returning late from the fields might nod to the soldiers, exchanging a word or two, though conversation was brief and formal. The patrol was not meant to socialize, but to remind all that order stood watch, even in the deepest hours. During festivals, the patrol continued. Lantern festivals filled the towns with light. Drums echoed from temples, and the scent of roasted chestnuts filled the air. Still, soldiers walked their routes, passing through laughter and music without stopping. On the new year, When families stayed awake to welcome fortune, the patrol marked the contrast by continuing with the same slow pace. The empire did not rest, and so the patrol did not rest either. Occasionally, records describe moments when the routine was broken. A group of bandits might attempt to steal from a caravan, or a drunk villager might cause trouble near the gate. In such cases, the patrol responded with whistles or clappers to summon reinforcements. Yet these events were uncommon, and most years passed without major incident. Indeed, the measure of a soldier's success was that nothing happened at all. A quiet year was the highest accomplishment, though it left no glory to remember. Beyond their duties, soldiers were also tied to the military household system. This system bound families to service, requiring sons to follow their fathers. It was a burden, for it limited choice, yet it also created continuity. The patrol routes of one generation became the routes of the next, and family histories were written not in heroic battles, but in lists of shifts kept, nights walked, and gates guarded. Some families served for decades in the same post, their names recorded in dry registers of officials who rarely visited. The empire valued them for their reliability, not their fame. Climate and geography also shaped their lives. In the southern provinces, patrols passed through humid air filled with the sound of frogs and crickets, while in the north, soldiers marched against bitter winds sweeping across open plains. In coastal regions, they listened to the crashing of waves, and in mountain passes, the eerie call of owls echoed against stone cliffs. Each landscape offered its own monotony, a backdrop that repeated itself endlessly until it became part of the soldier's inner rhythm. Sleep, ironically, was both scarce and precious. Soldiers finished their watch and returned to the barracks to rest, often sleeping on hard mats with only thin blankets. Snores filled the room, interrupted by the shuffle of boots as the next watch prepared to leave. Dreams, when they came, were shallow, for the body remained alert to the sound of the drum that might call them again. In this way, the cycle turned, night after night, with little variation. To think of these patrols is to think of the empire's quiet foundation. While emperors sat on dragon thrones and ministers debated policies in ornate halls, these men walked silently under the stars, their names forgotten, their faces unknown, their duty constant. They were not heroes of epic tales, but without their uneventful steps, the grand structures of the Ming world would have rested on shaky ground. As the night patrols of the Ming Dynasty stretched across centuries, their routines became not only a practice of security, but also a symbol of order in a vast empire that demanded predictability above all else. The soldiers who walked these quiet paths often found their own sense of identity shaped by the repetition, for their lives revolved around schedules that rarely shifted. To understand them is to understand how an empire as large as Ming China could function smoothly in times of peace, relying not on constant military action, but on the persistence of ordinary men who embodied patience and endurance. A typical patrol began in the barracks with the sounding of the drum, a deep echo that rolled across the compound and reminded every soldier that the watch was about to change. 2 or 3 men would rise, adjust their belts, and prepare their lanterns. The lantern was not just a tool for light, but a marker of authority, its soft glow signaling the presence of imperial order in the night. Without the lantern, a man walking the road was just another villager, but with it, he became a representative of the emperor, however distant the court in Beijing might seem. The patrol route itself was carefully measured and rarely altered. Maps of local posts reveal straight lines connecting gates, bridges, and warehouses, and each of these points was expected to be reached at precise times. The men marked their progress by striking clappers or reporting to a checkpoint where a watchman sat, recording the time of their arrival. Such records were stored away in official ledgers, seldom read again, but the act of recording mattered. It showed that the system was functioning, that the empire's network of guardians was awake, and that every small corner of territory remained connected to the great structure of Ming authority. Yet in practice, the soldiers experienced these duties in silence. The sounds they noticed were not dramatic but ordinary. The creak of their own boots, the faint crackle of the lantern wick, the distant call of a night bird, the splash of a frog jumping into water, the sigh of wind moving through fields of millet. Such details filled the hours of patrol, and they were the true companions of the men who walked. Words were few, for speaking loudly was discouraged, And besides, the men knew each other so well that conversation was unnecessary. After months and years of walking the same paths together, they communicated with gestures, or with the quiet rhythm of steps that fell in unison. Over time, the patrol became less an act of vigilance and more a ritual of presence. The Empire did not expect them to fight nightly battles, but to demonstrate that the state was watching. That law existed even when no one tested it. Villagers were reassured by the sight of the lanterns, merchants trusted that their goods were safe, and officials recorded that the night had passed without disturbance. The absence of drama was the goal, and so the soldiers performed their roles with a kind of calm detachment. Still, there were moments that broke the monotony, and these were remembered for years. A lantern might be blown out by sudden wind, plunging the road into darkness, and the soldiers would fumble to relight it, anxious about being caught unprepared. A sudden storm might sweep through, turning the patrol into a struggle through rain and mud, with cloaks soaked and boots heavy. Or a wild animal might cross the path, a stray dog, a boar, or even a leopard in southern provinces, and the men would freeze, holding their breath until it passed. These rare moments became stories told quietly in the barracks afterward, small points of excitement in otherwise uneventful years. The seasons brought variation as well. In spring, the air carried the scent of blossoms, and soldiers noticed petals scattered across their paths. In summer, the heat pressed down, and sweat soaked through their uniforms as cicadas sang endlessly. Autumn brought cooler winds and the smell of harvested fields, while winter tested their endurance with cold nights when frost clung to their hair and the lantern light shivered in the icy air. These seasonal changes marked time more than calendars did, for the patrols remained constant no matter the month or year. Beyond the routine of walking, soldiers were bound to paperwork that defined their existence. The Ming bureaucracy required detailed records, and every patrol was logged in registers by officers who noted the names of the men, the time of the watch, and any unusual event. A missing signature or a delayed report could bring suspicion, and punishment might follow. The bureaucracy cared less about the soldiers' hardship than about the neatness of records. Thus, the men learned to value punctuality, for it was safer to arrive on time at a checkpoint than to risk the wrath of an official who saw an incomplete ledger. Life outside of patrols was simple and restrained. When not on duty, soldiers often worked in small fields attached to their barracks, growing vegetables or tending chickens. Their families lived nearby, bound to the same system of military households, and children grew up watching their fathers leave for night patrols, knowing that they too would one day follow. The cycle of life was therefore as rigid as the schedule of patrol, and generations passed in the shadow of the same walls, repeating the same duties. What may seem monotonous to us today was, for them, the shape of existence itself. It offered stability, if not freedom, and predictability, if not joy. For the Ming state, this predictability was priceless. The empire stretched across mountains, rivers, deserts, and seas, and its survival depended not on constant heroics, but on the steady hum of ordinary duties. The quiet patrol of soldiers, lantern in hand, symbolized the reliability of a government that could manage millions of lives without collapsing into chaos. The patrol was thus more than just men walking through the night. It was the embodiment of Ming order, a living sign that the empire's heart continued to beat, slowly and steadily, under the watchful eyes of men whose names have long been forgotten, but whose footsteps once echoed across the silent roads of China. In continuing with the quiet world of Ming Dynasty patrols, it is important to remember that the empire did not simply rely on walls or fortresses, but on the silent discipline of men who lived within the structure of routine. The Ming Dynasty was vast, covering fertile plains, distant frontiers, and crowded cities, and yet the night watch remained a common thread uniting every corner of the state. From northern garrisons guarding windswept plains to southern posts near river deltas filled with damp mist, the patrols followed the same principle. Keep walking, keep watching, and ensure that nothing unusual disturbed the long, dark hours. A soldier preparing for patrol often performed the same actions every day until they became instinct. He would tie his sash tightly, check his lantern, and adjust the straw sandals or cloth boots that carried him through miles of walking. His weapon, often little more than a short sword or wooden staff, was inspected though seldom used. The true mark of his duty was not combat but presence, and the lantern flame was the quiet badge of his authority. To the villagers, this glow in the distance was as much a part of the night as the stars above. The patrol routes themselves were carefully designed, often circling storage areas for grain, granaries, warehouses, and gates that led into towns. These were the Empire's lifelines, and to protect them was to protect stability. Patrols were instructed to pass checkpoints at precise intervals, with times recorded by the sound of drums or bells. Accuracy mattered, for the Ming system thrived on bureaucracy. Reports were collected, signatures noted, and scrolls filled with the dry but necessary documentation of ordinary nights. Each report was seldom read again, but the act of recording gave structure to the otherwise uneventful hours. Soldiers walked with companions, rarely alone, for 2 or 3 men on patrol created a sense of balance and accountability. They moved together in silence, their steps measured, the lantern light bobbing gently between them. Communication was minimal, often limited to a nod or brief comment, for conversation was discouraged and unnecessary. The silence itself became part of the ritual, allowing the men to blend into the steady rhythm of the night. Occasionally, officers inspected the routes, ensuring that the soldiers did not linger or shirk their duties. Discipline was strict, and falling asleep or abandoning a watch could result in severe punishment. For neglecting the patrol was seen as a failure not just against one's commander, but against the emperor himself. Thus, even in the most monotonous stretches of duty, the men forced themselves to remain alert. Some chewed tea leaves to stay awake, others hummed softly or tapped their staffs against the ground to keep rhythm. The monotony was their greatest enemy, yet the empire depended on their persistence. Villagers, too, were shaped by the presence of patrols. Families closing their shutters at night often did so with comfort, knowing that footsteps would echo on the road outside. Farmers carrying goods home from distant fields sometimes passed the soldiers, nodding in acknowledgement before hurrying back to their homes. Children watched from paper windows, whispering as the lantern light drifted past, before finally falling asleep. For them, the patrol was not a spectacle, but an ordinary rhythm of life. Over the seasons, the patrols experienced the subtle shifts of nature. In spring, blossoms scented the air, petals scattered along the path, and the soldiers' boots pressed gently into damp soil. In summer, the heat clung to their uniforms, sweat dripped, and cicadas sang endlessly in the trees. Autumn brought the rustle of harvested grain, the sharp smell of smoke rising from fields, and cooler winds across the roads. Winter tested their endurance most severely as frost formed on their lashes and the lantern flames flickered against icy air. Yet through every season, the patrols did not cease. Duty was steady, unbroken, and loyal to the idea that safety came from vigilance without end. Records preserved in local gazetteers describe rare disruptions to this order. A thief might be caught sneaking into a granary. A stray fire might be spotted by the watch and extinguished before spreading. A band of travelers arriving after dusk might be questioned and guided to the proper gate. These events were noted carefully, but they were the exceptions that proved the rule. For the vast majority of nights, the patrol passed without event, and it was precisely this uneventfulness that made them successful. Soldiers themselves measured their lives by these long stretches of quiet. Weeks blurred into months, years into decades, with little change but the shifting faces of comrades and the endless march of seasons. Fathers grew old on patrol, sons replaced them, and generations of families repeated the same steps along the same roads. To serve was not a choice but an inheritance, for the military household system bound families to duty across time. This continuity gave the empire stability, though it also trapped men within a life defined by monotony. Still, within the monotony, there was meaning. Each quiet patrol represented a thread in the vast fabric of Ming order, invisible yet essential. Without these footsteps, trade could falter, villages could grow fearful, and officials could not rest in the knowledge that their districts were secure. Thus, the soldiers, though forgotten by history, were the silent keepers of stability. Their lives were not written into heroic tales, but the empire's peace rested on their shoulders. To think of them now is to imagine an endless line of lanterns stretching into the night, moving slowly, evenly, steadily, each one a small flame of order in the darkness. When we turn our attention once more to the ordinary soldiers of the Ming Dynasty, we discover that their lives were woven into a pattern of duties that rarely shifted, a design of routine that was both a burden and a source of stability. The empire depended on their presence, yet their existence was marked not by grand battles or spectacular events, but by endless hours of quiet watching and walking. Their story is not one of sudden excitement, but of steady rhythm, and it is this rhythm that preserved order across one of the largest empires in history. A patrol began long before the soldiers stepped onto the road. It began in the barracks where the men lived, plain buildings with hard floors and minimal furnishings. A soldier rose from his straw mat, stretched stiff muscles, and adjusted his simple uniform of quilted cotton. He checked his belt, tightened the knots of his boots, and lifted the lantern that would guide his path. The flame within the paper covering was small, trembling, and easily disturbed by wind, but it was the most important object of the night. To carry the lantern was to carry the authority of the state, and its glow was the reminder to villagers and travelers alike that the empire's watch never ceased. Patrol routes were mapped with careful attention to time. The Ming bureaucracy valued punctuality above bravery, and every step of the patrol was measured. Guards were expected to appear at checkpoints at precise intervals, and the beating of drums or the ringing of bells announced the changes of the watch. Reports were written even when nothing happened, and most of the time, nothing did. Scrolls filled with dull records of nights without incident piled up in offices. Yet those piles were the true achievement, for they meant that the empire's quiet held firm. The soldiers themselves learned to endure this monotony. They walked side by side, usually in pairs or small groups, their words few, their steps steady. Speaking loudly was discouraged, and besides, the men knew each other so well that conversation seemed unnecessary. They communicated instead through habit, nodding at the same landmarks, adjusting their pace without a word, and moving in silent harmony. The night sounds filled the silence, the hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, the bark of a dog, or the faint rustle of wind in bamboo groves. These small details became the background music of their service, repeated until it etched itself into their memory. Occasionally, weather transformed the routine into hardship. A summer storm might drench the soldiers until their clothes clung to their skin, their lanterns nearly extinguished by sheets of rain. In winter, their breath rose like smoke in the frigid air, frost formed on their lashes, and the lantern flame flickered against the cold wind. In spring, blossoms fell across the path, their pale petals scattering beneath the boots of the patrol. In autumn, the air carried the scent of harvest, of drying grain and smoke from distant fields. These changes gave slight variation to lives otherwise defined by repetition. Though danger was rare, the soldiers were trained to respond. Each carried a whistle or wooden clapper to be struck if trouble appeared. A thief attempting to break into a warehouse, a fight breaking out near a gate, or a suspicious traveler on the road could be met with the sound of warning, summoning reinforcements from the guardhouse. But these moments were uncommon, and in truth, most soldiers completed years of duty without ever facing serious confrontation. The empire measured their success not by battles won, but by nights undisturbed. Behind the patrols was the structure of the military household system, binding families to service generation after generation. A boy born to a soldier's family could expect to follow the same path, inheriting the duty as he inherited his father's tools and uniform. Life was narrow but certain, shaped by the steady expectation that the watch must continue. Families lived near the posts, wives and children growing accustomed to the sight of fathers leaving at dusk, lantern in hand, returning at dawn with tired steps but little to tell. Their stories were not dramatic but practical, filled with the concerns of food, clothing, and keeping warm. Yet this quiet life was essential to the stability of the state. Without the patrols, trade routes could be threatened, villages unsettled, and officials deprived of the confidence that order prevailed. The very uneventfulness of the patrols was their achievement, for they created an invisible shield across the empire. No one wrote poems about them, no plays celebrated their names, but the peace they maintained allowed scholars to write, merchants to trade, and farmers to plant without fear. To us now, centuries later, their lives may appear dull, but dullness was the very essence of their purpose. To imagine them is to imagine an endless line of men moving quietly under the stars, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness, their footsteps steady and unbroken. Night after night, season after season, generation after generation, they carried on, and through their persistence, the Ming Dynasty endured. The soldiers of the Ming Dynasty patrols lived lives that blurred into one another, so much so that it can be difficult to imagine a single night apart from the long chain of nights that came before and after. Each patrol was like a drop of water in an endless river, indistinguishable from the rest, yet together forming the quiet flow of empire. To walk the patrol was not to seek honor, but to embrace repetition, and repetition was the true heart of their service. As dusk fell, the barracks stirred with the familiar rhythm of preparation. The men tightened their uniforms, adjusted belts, and lifted their lanterns from their hooks. Oil had to be measured carefully, for a lantern running out mid-patrol was seen as negligence. The small flames flickered to life one by one, filling the guardhouse with soft light before being carried into the open air. The soldiers walked out into a world of muted sound, where the chatter of daytime gave way to the subtle tones of night. They passed gates where officials had already retired, past markets where stalls stood empty and silent, past homes where families settled behind paper windows, the light of their candles fading. The patrol moved in pairs or trios, the lantern glow their signature, their shadows stretching long across walls and narrow roads. The Empire prized this visibility, for the sight of a lantern told villagers that the Emperor's order extended even into the stillness of the night. A patrol's duties were uneventful yet exact. They walked their prescribed route, pausing at checkpoints marked by stones, gates, or simple posts. At each point, they confirmed their presence by being seen, or by striking wooden clappers. These clappers, sharp in sound, traveled far in the quiet of the night, and their echoes reassured anyone listening that the soldiers were awake. If no sound was heard, questions arose, and officers investigated. The system allowed little room for neglect. The men themselves relied on habit to endure the long hours. They counted steps between landmarks, memorized the silhouettes of trees and walls, and learned to recognize the smallest noises. A dog barking, a donkey braying, a shutter creaking in the wind, all became signals that the world remained unchanged. When something was different, such as an unfamiliar noise or movement, their attention sharpened, though often the cause was nothing more than a stray animal or gust of wind. The monotony was occasionally broken by weather. Heavy rains soaked uniforms and extinguished lanterns, forcing soldiers to shield the flame with their hands. Snow turned paths into silent whiteness, muffling footsteps and making the world feel even more deserted. In the heat of summer, sweat streamed down their faces as insects swarmed around the lantern light. Each season demanded endurance, but none excused absence. Patrols did not pause for storms, cold, or fatigue, for the Empire's expectation was constancy. Food and rest were modest rewards for their effort. After a night's patrol, the men returned to their barracks to eat bowls of rice or millet porridge, sometimes with dried fish or pickled greens. They lay down on straw mats in crowded rooms, their bodies weary, but their minds at ease knowing their duty was fulfilled. Sleep came quickly, broken only by the next drum signal that summoned them again. In this way, life passed in cycles of watch, eat, and sleep, a pattern repeated until years blended into one another. Families of soldiers lived within this system as well. Sons inherited their father's duties, wives managed households near the posts, and daughters grew accustomed to seeing their fathers or brothers leave at night. The community surrounding the barracks existed in quiet acceptance of the military household system, bound by law to continue service across generations. It was a life of predictability, and predictability was the Empire's strength. Records from local gazetteers mentioned small incidents that revealed the value of patrols. A barn fire extinguished before spreading, a thief caught sneaking near a granary, a lost traveler guided to safety. Such minor events justified countless hours of uneventful walking. Without vigilance, even these small matters could have grown dangerous. To the Empire, preventing trouble was as important as responding to it. And the patrols were the thin line between peace and disorder. The men themselves did not see their lives as heroic, but they accepted them as necessary. They rarely dreamed of glory, for opportunities for advancement were few. Most served quietly until age or injury excused them, and their names disappeared into forgotten records. Yet in their anonymity lay their importance. The Ming Dynasty relied on these unseen guardians, whose steady steps carried the weight of order. To imagine them now is to picture an endless path under the stars, lanterns glowing like scattered fireflies, each light a promise of safety, each step a quiet assurance that the Empire was at rest. Their monotony was not failure, but success, for the absence of alarm meant that the system held strong. Night after night, year after year, they walked, and in their walking, the Ming Dynasty endured. The patrols of the Ming Dynasty carried on as if time itself was measured by the rhythm of their steps. For while dynasties rose and fell in distant lands, the soldiers walked the same routes, night after night, without pause. Their lives became intertwined with the geography of their posts, so that every stone, every tree, every gate became part of their memory. A soldier could close his eyes and trace his path in silence, recalling the exact number of steps between a bridge and a checkpoint, the familiar tilt of a roof against the horizon, the way shadows gathered under a certain tree at midnight. Such knowledge was not glamorous, but it was essential, for their world was one of detail, repetition, and the constant duty of watching. The night began with signals from the guardhouse, the drum and the bell, deep sounds that rolled through the compound, reminding men that the watch was to change. They rose, adjusted their uniforms, tied belts, and picked up lanterns filled with oil that had to last until their route was completed. The lantern was fragile, its paper sides trembling in the wind, but it was a symbol of authority, a reminder that the empire was awake even while its people slept. The patrol set off, their footsteps steady, the lantern glow bobbing ahead of them like a moving star. Villagers glimpsed it through shutters, recognizing its familiar light before lying back down to rest. To them, the patrol was part of the natural order, as ordinary as the phases of the moon or the crow of the rooster at dawn. For the soldiers, the patrol was less about excitement than about persistence. They followed routes that circled granaries, passed through gates, and traced along walls. At checkpoints, they were required to announce themselves by striking clappers or sounding whistles, sharp noises that echoed into the quiet night. These signals were recorded by watchmen, entered into scrolls, and later stored away in offices, seldom read again, but still valued as proof of order. The men themselves lived in silence, speaking little as they walked. Words were not necessary, for each knew the routine so well that gestures or a shared rhythm of steps were enough. They carried short swords or wooden staffs, but these were rarely drawn, for the lantern's presence was often a stronger deterrent than any weapon. Most nights ended with nothing but the sound of footsteps and the faint hiss of oil burning. The seasons shaped the patrol in ways both subtle and relentless. In spring, soldiers moved through fields heavy with dew, blossoms drifting onto their shoulders, frogs croaking in the distance. Summer brought heavy air, insects swarming around lantern light, and sweat dripping into their eyes. Autumn cooled the nights, leaves crackled underfoot, and the scent of smoke from harvest fires carried through the air. Winter tested them most harshly, with breath freezing into mist, hands numb against the lantern pole, and boots crunching over frost. Each season added hardship, but none excused absence, for the patrol had to continue. The monotony of the watch became a test of endurance more than bravery. Soldiers struggled against drowsiness, sometimes chewing bitter tea leaves or striking their staffs on the road to stay alert. Some counted steps or hummed softly, small methods to push back against fatigue. Falling asleep on duty was dangerous, not only because it risked neglect, but because punishment could be severe. Discipline in the Ming military was strict, and the shame of failure lingered longer than the punishment itself. Families of soldiers accepted this life as part of their inheritance. The military household system bound sons to follow fathers, and so children grew up watching lanterns depart into the night, knowing that one day their hands would hold the same poles, their feet trace the same routes. Wives managed homes near the barracks, preparing simple meals, patching uniforms, and waiting for men to return at dawn. Entire generations were woven into the rhythm of patrol, their lives defined by the same routines that had shaped those before them. Occasionally, incidents disrupted the monotony. A thief might be caught, a fire spotted, or a traveler delayed at a gate. These rare moments gave meaning to the endless hours, justifying the presence of men who otherwise walked through silence. But the true value of the patrol lay not in these incidents, but in their absence. The empire considered a quiet night to be the greatest success, for it meant the people could rest undisturbed, merchants could trade with confidence, and officials could trust that their districts remained secure. To think of these patrols now is to imagine an empire breathing quietly through the night, its lungs filled by the steady footsteps of men whose names were forgotten, but whose duty shaped the very stability of the realm. Their lanterns glowed like scattered stars across roads, walls, and gates, a constellation of order stretching across the Ming world. They were the silent guardians, the unnoticed keepers of peace, whose monotony was their triumph, and whose footsteps echoed the promise that the empire was safe. The patrols of the Ming Dynasty did not exist in isolation, but were part of a carefully woven web of administration that extended across the empire. Behind every pair of soldiers walking with lanterns in the night stood the structure of local officials, record keepers, supply clerks, and commanders who ensured that even the smallest post remained connected to the vast machinery of the state. To understand the patrols fully is to see them not only as men walking roads, but as moving pieces in a system that valued routine, paperwork, and the slow but steady enforcement of order. Each watch began with the sound of the drum, a heavy beat that rolled across the barracks and reminded men that their shift was at hand. They rose from straw mats, tied their sashes, adjusted belts, and took up their lanterns, repeating actions so familiar that they no longer required thought. The lanterns were filled with oil carefully measured by quartermasters, for shortages were recorded and reported up the chain of command. Even such small details were part of the bureaucracy, for the empire believed that order in the smallest matters created stability in the greatest. The patrol then moved out, their shadows stretching long under the pale moonlight, their lantern light bobbing softly on the ground. They walked through gates that closed tightly at night, past warehouses where grain was stored for taxes, and along roads where only an occasional traveler still moved. At each checkpoint, the soldiers were required to mark their presence. Some posts used wooden boards on which the men scratched tallies, others relied on a watchman who noted the time of arrival. In some places, the system was stricter, requiring soldiers to carry tokens that were exchanged at checkpoints to prove they had completed the route. All of these records were later bundled into reports that filled dusty shelves of local offices. Few read them again, yet their existence reassured higher officials that order was being maintained. The men themselves endured the monotony with quiet resignation. They walked side by side, speaking little, their steps matching without effort after years of repetition. They listened to the same sounds every night: the bark of dogs, the chirp of insects, the distant creak of water wheels turning slowly in the dark. The monotony itself became a kind of companion, for it reminded them that nothing had changed, that the empire still rested in peace. Sometimes weather tested their resolve. Heavy rains turned the roads into rivers of mud, soaking uniforms and dimming lantern flames. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling footsteps and making the world seem eerily silent. Heat in the summer brought swarms of insects that danced in the lantern light, while autumn winds carried the smell of smoke from harvested fields. These changes gave slight variation to their lives, but the duty remained constant. Rarely did events break the routine, but when they did, they were recorded carefully. A thief caught near a granary, a fire extinguished before spreading, a suspicious stranger turned away at a gate. Such incidents reminded the men that their patrols had purpose, even if most nights passed without event. Yet in truth, the value of the patrol was not in responding to danger, but in preventing it. The simple presence of soldiers, their lanterns glowing in the dark, was enough to deter mischief. Villagers trusted this presence, sleeping easier knowing that footsteps echoed on the road outside. Families of soldiers were bound to this life as well, for the military household system required sons to follow fathers, ensuring continuity across generations. Children grew up watching lanterns depart into the night, knowing they would one day carry the same lights. Wives managed households near the barracks, preparing simple meals, patching uniforms, and waiting for the return of their husbands at dawn. The cycle was unbroken, and in its unbroken nature lay its strength. For the Ming state, stability mattered more than excitement, and predictability was the highest form of order. To look back on these patrols now is to see an empire whose power rested not only in emperors and ministers, but in countless forgotten men whose footsteps never ceased. Their names are lost, their faces unknown, yet their work formed the invisible framework of peace. They were not celebrated in poems or remembered in tales, but their lanterns once glowed like quiet stars across villages, walls, and roads, a constellation of order stretching into the night. The monotony of their lives was their true accomplishment, for in their silence and repetition, they gave the empire what it needed most: rest. The long history of the Ming Dynasty patrols can be seen as an endless cycle of footsteps and lantern light, a rhythm that outlasted the lives of the men who performed it. For decades and even centuries, the same roads were traced, the same checkpoints marked, and the same signals sounded from guardhouses at the appointed hours. To picture a patrol is to picture not one night, but countless nights layered upon one another, indistinguishable in detail yet, together forming the unbroken shield of empire. A soldier beginning his patrol in the late 15th century would have followed the same rituals as one living in the 16th or 17th century, for little changed across generations. He would rise when the drum called, adjust his quilted uniform, tighten his belt, and take up the lantern entrusted to him. The flame inside the paper casing was small, fragile, and flickering, yet it symbolized the authority of the emperor who reigned far away in Beijing. As the patrol moved through the night, the lantern became their identity, a light of order against the formless dark. They passed by warehouses filled with grain, for grain was the lifeblood of the state, transported along rivers and stored for taxes. They walked around granaries that had stood for decades, their wooden walls weathered but secure, and they circled the gates of towns that closed tightly at dusk. These places were not exciting, yet they were essential, and the soldiers were tasked with protecting them not through battle but through visibility, for to be seen was to deter. At checkpoints, the soldiers announced themselves by clapping wooden boards together, striking bells, or exchanging tokens. The echoes carried through the silence, reassuring villagers and reminding officials that the watch remained active. Records were made, tallies marked, and scrolls filled with notes of nights where nothing occurred. It may seem tedious now, but the empire's bureaucracy thrived on such paperwork, believing that order could be proven by record even when no event disturbed the peace. The monotony was the point, for a quiet night was the highest achievement. Soldiers endured the silence with discipline. They spoke little, conserving words, letting their steps carry them in steady rhythm. Each knew the path so well that conversation was unnecessary. They recognized every stone, every tree, every corner where shadows fell. They counted steps between landmarks, hummed softly to themselves, or tapped lantern poles against the ground to stay awake. Drowsiness was their constant enemy, for to fall asleep while on duty was to invite shame and punishment. Discipline was harsh, and men feared the disgrace of failure more than the weariness of walking. The seasons gave slight variation. In spring, the air was cool, and blossoms scattered across the road. In summer, sweat clung to uniforms as insects swarmed in the lantern light. Autumn brought sharp winds and the smell of harvested fields, while winter tested endurance with freezing nights, the frost biting at skin. The lantern flame trembling in the cold air. Yet no season excused absence, for the patrols were constant, unbroken by weather. Families lived within the system as much as the soldiers themselves. Sons inherited the duty of fathers, bound by the military household system. Children watched their fathers leave at dusk and return at dawn, carrying lanterns now dimmed, faces weary, steps heavy but uncomplaining. Wives managed the homes, tended gardens, prepared porridge, and kept the uniforms patched. Generations passed in the same rhythm, a rhythm that seemed endless to those within it. Occasionally, incidents broke the monotony. A thief caught near a storage building, a fire spotted in time to be extinguished, a lost traveler guided to the correct road. Such small events justified the countless nights of uneventful watching. Yet these moments were rare, and the men themselves measured success not by excitement, but by its absence. To them, a quiet night was a good night, and a quiet year was the highest accomplishment. The empire depended on this steadiness. Officials in distant cities could sleep with confidence because they knew patrols walked in villages, towns, and posts scattered across the land. Merchants could trade along rivers and roads, knowing that soldiers' lanterns shone in the dark. Farmers could rest in their beds, unafraid of theft, because footsteps echoed on the paths outside. The patrol was not glorious, but it was essential. To think of them now is to imagine endless lines of lanterns, glowing like small stars across the land, moving slowly and steadily under the vast night sky. Each lantern represented discipline, each step a promise of safety, and each uneventful night a victory of order over chaos. These men did not seek recognition, and history has not remembered their names. Yet their monotony was the quiet strength of the Ming Dynasty, a strength that allowed the empire to endure. As we reach the final reflection on the quiet patrols of the Ming Dynasty, it becomes clear that their importance was never in moments of drama, but in the steady rhythm of uneventful nights. The soldiers who carried lanterns and walked familiar roads were not remembered in poems or celebrated in paintings, yet their silent presence was the fabric that held the empire together. For centuries, they lived lives of repetition, and in that repetition lay both the weight of their duty and the peace of millions of people who never thought about them at all. A soldier preparing for his patrol, in the deep night, followed the same motions his father had and his son would, lifting the lantern, adjusting his uniform, tightening the belt around his waist. He stepped onto the road with his comrades, the lantern's glow marking the start of another shift. The routes never changed much, circling warehouses, gates, bridges, and stretches of walls. Each stop was carefully recorded, signals given, tallies marked. The bureaucracy that defined the Ming Dynasty prized such records, for they transformed silence into proof of order. Each blank scroll filled with notes of nothing unusual was in fact a declaration of success, for it meant the empire was at peace. The soldiers themselves did not expect gratitude, for their lives were bound by the military household system, tying families to service for generations. Sons inherited the roles of fathers, wives accepted the long absences of husbands through the night, and children grew up watching lanterns depart into the darkness, knowing one day their hands would carry the same fragile light. The monotony stretched across decades, a cycle of footsteps, reports, meals of rice or millet, and rest on straw mats. Yet in this monotony there was meaning. Each step was a barrier against disorder, each lantern a sign of stability, each quiet night a victory unmarked by celebration. Weather tested them, yet they endured. In summer, sweat ran down their backs as insects swirled around the lantern glow. In winter, their breath froze in the air as frost clung to their uniforms. Spring brought blossoms scattered across their path. Autumn, the sharp scent of harvested fields. The seasons passed, but the patrol did not change, and the empire's reliance on their persistence never wavered. Rarely did events break this pattern, but when they did, they confirmed the necessity of the watch. A fire caught early, a thief deterred, a traveler guided to safety, small acts that prevented greater harm. These were the exceptions, reminders of why soldiers walked through endless hours of silence. Yet their greatest service lay in ensuring that most nights passed without incident at all. To picture the Ming Dynasty at rest is to picture these men in the background, their lanterns glowing faintly like stars scattered across the empire's roads. While emperors issued decrees and ministers debated policies, these forgotten soldiers walked on, their duty humble but unbroken. They were the unseen heartbeat of the night, and their footsteps echoed the quiet assurance that order prevailed. Now, centuries later, their names are gone, their faces unknown, and their lives buried in records that few read. But the empire they served endured in part because of them, because ordinary men accepted the monotony of patrol and turned it into the foundation of peace. Their story is not one of heroes, but of constancy, not of battles, but of silence, not of glory, but of the quiet flame of a lantern carried faithfully through the darkness. To think of them is to imagine an endless chain of nights where nothing happened, and to recognize that in this nothing lay the very essence of stability. The Ming patrols were guardians of stillness, keepers of uneventful hours, and their legacy, though uncelebrated, remains a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength of an empire lies not in the noise of battle, but in the quiet persistence of those who kept watch when the world slept. That is the end of our previous story. Before we move on, may I kindly ask you for a like and a subscription. Your support helps us continue bringing you these calm, bedtime histories. And now, let us continue with the next tale in our series of boring history for sleep. The Quiet Patrols of Ming Dynasty Soldiers. In the vast world of the Ming Dynasty, security did not rest only on its high walls or powerful armies, but on the patient footsteps of soldiers who patrolled quietly through the long nights. These men were not heroes of legend. Their names were rarely recorded, yet their constant presence allowed villages to sleep, merchants to trade, and officials to govern without fear of sudden disorder. The patrols were uneventful by design, for their greatest achievement was that nothing happened at all. To imagine their lives is to imagine routines stretched endlessly across years. The same steps repeated, the same lanterns carried, the same checkpoints marked, until their service became almost invisible, like the rhythm of breathing. A patrol began as the sun slipped behind hills and mountains, the sky turning violet and then black. Soldiers rose from their simple barracks, plain buildings of timber and packed earth, where straw mats lined the floors and a single courtyard served as both gathering place and kitchen. They tightened their belts, adjusted their quilted uniforms, and lifted lanterns filled with carefully measured oil. The lanterns, small flames trembling behind paper covers, were their greatest symbols of duty. Without them, they were only men walking. With them, they were representatives of the emperor himself. The routes they followed were always the same. They circled town gates, passed along walls, crossed bridges, and stopped at checkpoints marked by stones or wooden posts. At each stop, they made their presence known. Sometimes this meant striking wooden clappers that echoed sharply in the night, sometimes exchanging tokens with a watchman, sometimes simply leaving a mark on a board. These actions were recorded in registers that filled dusty shelves of local offices, rarely read again yet always preserved, for the Ming state valued record-keeping as proof of order. The patrol itself was uneventful. 2 or 3 men walked side by side, speaking little, their steps slow and steady. The night gave them familiar sounds: the bark of dogs, the call of owls, the chirp of crickets, the creak of water wheels turning lazily in streams. They came to know every detail of the path: the leaning tree that cast long shadows, the stone that always caught the lantern light, the roof tiles that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. In time, they no longer noticed these things consciously, for they became part of the inner map carried in memory. Villagers grew used to their presence. Children, before closing their eyes, sometimes peeked through paper windows to glimpse the glow of lanterns drifting past. Farmers returning late from the fields nodded silently to the men. Shopkeepers locking doors felt reassured to hear footsteps outside. The patrols were not dramatic, but their constancy was comfort. Season after season, they endured the elements. In spring, blossoms scattered across the road, petals falling softly on uniforms. In summer, sweat rolled down faces while insects swarmed around the lantern light. In autumn, cool winds carried the smell of harvested fields and wood smoke. In winter, breath froze in the air, and frost clung to eyelashes as boots crunched on frozen earth. Yet in every season, the patrols continued. Weather did not excuse absence, for the empire demanded constancy, and constancy was what kept it whole. Food and rest were modest. After a night of patrol, the men returned to bowls of millet porridge, sometimes flavored with pickled vegetables or dried fish if supplies allowed. They lay down on straw mats, their bodies weary, their minds dulled by repetition. Sleep came quickly, broken only by the sound of drums that signaled the next watch. Life outside of patrol was simple. Soldiers tended small plots of land, repaired uniforms, or oiled weapons that were rarely used. Families lived nearby, bound to service by the military household system. Sons inherited their father's duty, wives managed homes, and generations passed in the same rhythm of preparation, patrol, and rest. Advancement was rare, and glory almost non-existent. The soldiers knew this, but they also knew that their constancy was valued, even if uncelebrated. Rarely did incidents occur, but when they did, they reminded everyone of the patrol's importance. A thief deterred from entering a warehouse, a fire spotted before it spread, a traveler guided to safety. All small events that justified countless nights of silence. Yet the true value of the patrol was not in these exceptions, but in the long chain of uneventful nights. To the Ming state, peace was measured not by victories, but by the absence of trouble, and the patrols ensured that absence. To us now, their lives may seem dull, yet dullness was their triumph. The lanterns they carried glowed like small stars scattered across the empire. Their footsteps echoed like the quiet heartbeat of the night. They were guardians of stillness, keepers of routine, protectors of silence, and their story is one of order sustained through endless repetition. Though forgotten by history, they were the quiet foundation on which the Ming Dynasty stood. When we continue to look at the quiet world of the Ming patrol soldiers, it becomes clear that their lives were bound not by moments of battle, but by the framework of repetition that shaped each day and night. Their duty was not to chase glory, but to preserve the silence of the empire, and in this silence lay the true strength of the Ming order. A soldier would wake at the sound of the drum, the deep beat rolling through the barracks to signal the change of watch. He rose from his straw mat, stretched his limbs stiff from rest, and prepared himself with movements so familiar they had become instinct. His uniform of quilted cotton was tied with a simple sash, his belt secured, his short sword adjusted though rarely drawn. The lantern was lifted from its hook, the oil checked carefully, the wick adjusted so that the flame would last the length of the route. To carry this fragile light was to carry authority, for the Empire's watch was symbolized not in swords, but in the glow of lanterns moving through the night. The patrol moved in pairs or groups of 3, their steps unhurried, their shadows long in the moonlight. They walked the same routes night after night, circling gates, tracing walls, and passing along the edges of warehouses where grain was stored for the emperor's taxes. Grain was the lifeblood of the empire, transported by rivers and stored in vast granaries, and so it was watched with the greatest care. Soldiers walked past these silent structures, their footsteps echoing softly against wooden walls, their lantern light falling on doors bolted tight until morning. At checkpoints, they stopped to confirm their presence. Sometimes this meant exchanging tokens, sometimes striking clappers that echoed sharply in the stillness, sometimes being observed by another watchman. The records were precise, entered into ledgers that filled dusty offices, seldom read again yet never discarded. For the Ming bureaucracy, the act of recording mattered as much as the act of patrolling, for order was proven through documentation. The soldiers themselves endured the monotony with patience. They spoke little as they walked, for there was no need for words. Each man knew the route so well that it became part of his memory, each landmark a reminder of distance covered and distance yet to go. They learned the sound of every dog in every yard, the way the wind moved through bamboo groves, the creak of wooden shutters as families closed their homes for the night. These small details filled the silence, and in them, the soldiers found both comfort and vigilance. The seasons shaped their experiences in ways that could not be ignored. In spring, they walked through damp air, the scent of blossoms drifting across the path, petals scattering underfoot. In summer, sweat clung to their uniforms as insects circled endlessly around the lantern flames. Autumn brought cooler nights, the air sharp with the smell of harvested fields and smoke from distant fires. Winter tested them most severely, as frost bit at their faces and boots crunched on frozen earth, the lantern flames trembling in the wind. Yet no season excused absence, for the empire demanded constancy, and constancy was the very purpose of their lives. The patrols were not glamorous, yet they shaped communities. Villagers slept knowing that footsteps echoed outside. Merchants trusted their goods were safe because lanterns glowed on the roads. Officials rested in their chambers with confidence that soldiers carried out their duties. Children peeked through windows, whispering as they watched the glow pass by, before falling asleep, reassured. Rarely did events break the silence, but when they did, they were noted carefully. A thief might be turned away, a fire spotted in time, a lost traveler guided safely to a gate. These were small acts, but they proved the necessity of countless uneventful nights. To the soldiers, a quiet patrol was success, and a quiet year was the highest accomplishment. Their families lived within this same rhythm. Sons inherited their father's duties, wives managed the modest households near the posts, daughters grew up in the shadow of barracks, all bound by the military household system that tied generations to service. Advancement was rare, recognition rarer still, but the empire valued them not for glory, but for endurance. To think of them now is to picture an endless chain of nights where lanterns glowed like faint stars scattered across the empire, footsteps steady, reports recorded, and silence preserved. They were guardians of nothing happening, protectors of uneventfulness, and in their monotony, they embodied the strength of the Ming state. Their lives remind us that sometimes the greatest achievement is not in action, but in the absence of it, in the quiet constancy that allows others to sleep without fear. The patrols of the Ming Dynasty were less about bravery in the face of danger and more about persistence in the face of monotony. A soldier's greatest skill was not the ability to wield a sword, but the ability to walk the same road night after night without faltering, without complaint, and without succumbing to fatigue or indifference. His world was measured in the steady rhythm of footsteps, the faint glow of lantern light, and the slow passage of hours until the drum or bell signaled that his watch was complete. To understand these men is to imagine a life stripped of drama, yet heavy with duty, where order was sustained not by action, but by endless repetition. The patrol routes were carefully laid out, each checkpoint precisely placed to ensure no area was left unwatched. Bridges, granaries, and gates were the priority, for they represented the Empire's lifelines. Soldiers passed these points with ritualistic regularity, their presence logged in tallies or confirmed by watchmen who sat in small huts with records to be stored later. Even when nothing happened, which was almost always, the act of recording mattered. It showed the Empire that order was intact, that the system worked, that discipline reached even into the stillness of midnight. A typical night unfolded in silence. The patrol moved along walls where ivy clung and shadows stretched long under the moon. They crossed narrow streets lined with shuttered homes, each one dark except for the faint glow of a dying candle. Dogs barked briefly and fell silent, recognizing the familiar sound of boots on packed earth. In fields beyond the town, frogs croaked steadily, their rhythm blending with the soldiers' footsteps. A watchman struck clappers at his post, the sharp sound cutting the night and echoing across the fields, a reminder that the Empire remained awake. The soldiers themselves often fought drowsiness. The body resisted long hours of walking in darkness, and many devised small methods to remain alert. Some chewed tea leaves for bitterness, others tapped their lantern poles against the ground in steady rhythm, and a few hummed quietly, their low voices blending with the night sounds. Falling asleep was unthinkable, for punishment was severe, and shame lingered long after. A soldier knew that even if no one else noticed his negligence, the Empire demanded his discipline, and failure was not excused. Weather played its own role in shaping the monotony. In spring, the air was heavy with dew, soaking boots and uniforms, the smell of blossoms drifting faintly across the patrol route. In summer, the heat clung to the body. Insects swarmed relentlessly around the lantern flame, and sweat darkened the cotton of uniforms. Autumn brought cooler nights, leaves crunching softly underfoot, the air filled with the scent of harvested grain and distant fires. Winter was the hardest season, the wind cutting like knives, frost biting at hands and faces, lantern flames trembling in icy gusts. Yet no season excused absence. The patrol moved on, as steady and constant as the turning of the seasons themselves. Families lived with the same rhythm. Sons inherited the duty from fathers, bound by the military household system, while wives managed homes near the barracks, raising children who would one day take the same walks. Life was predictable but narrow, built on the certainty that the patrol would continue as it always had. Advancement was rare, recognition almost non-existent, but stability was assured. And in the Ming state, stability was the highest value. Rare incidents gave slight variation. A thief might be spotted near a warehouse, a fire caught before it spread, a suspicious traveler questioned at a gate. These events were small but carefully recorded, proof that the system worked. Yet the true value of the patrol was not in responding to trouble but in preventing it altogether. The sight of a lantern moving through the night was often enough to discourage mischief, and so the soldiers' mere presence became their greatest weapon. To picture them now is to see endless lines of lanterns glowing faintly under the vast sky, scattered across roads, walls, and bridges like stars on the earth. Their footsteps were the quiet heartbeat of the Empire, their silence the assurance of safety, their monotony the very definition of success. Though their names are forgotten, their work formed the invisible structure on which the Ming Dynasty rested. A structure made not of stone or paper, but of the steady persistence of men who walked through the night so that others could sleep undisturbed. The story of the Ming patrols is best understood not as a tale of action, but as a picture of continuity. For their duty was not to face constant threats, but to show constant presence. A patrol began long before a soldier set foot on the road, beginning in the quiet of the barracks where preparation itself was ritual. The barracks were modest structures, built of wood and packed earth, their courtyards filled with the smell of smoke from cooking fires and the sound of boots being tightened. Men adjusted sashes, checked weapons, and tested lanterns, each movement practiced until it no longer required thought. The lanterns, fragile yet essential, were filled with carefully rationed oil, for waste was not tolerated and shortages were reported. When the drum sounded from the guardhouse, deep and slow, the patrol stepped into the night. Their lanterns glowed faintly, casting trembling circles of light, while their shadows stretched long across stone walls and dirt roads. They walked past warehouses filled with grain, the empire's lifeblood, and past gates bolted shut until dawn. They crossed bridges where water moved slowly beneath, the faint reflection of lanterns glimmering in the current. At each checkpoint, they confirmed their presence with clappers or whistles, or by exchanging tokens with watchmen stationed there. These records, later written into ledgers, formed the invisible web of bureaucracy that sustained the Ming order. Even when nothing happened, the documentation mattered, for it proved that vigilance was unbroken. The men themselves learned to endure silence, for words were few on patrol. Their duty was to observe, not to speak, and so they communicated with gestures, nods, or the shared rhythm of steps. Over time, their bodies adjusted to the rhythm. Their minds memorized every landmark, and their senses sharpened to the smallest details. They recognized the sound of each dog in each yard, the way wind moved through bamboo, the faint splash of a frog in a pond. The night became a familiar companion, unchanging, predictable, and steady. Villagers came to trust this constancy. Children peeked from paper windows to watch the lantern light drift by before closing their eyes to sleep. Farmers returning late from the fields nodded silently to the patrol, reassured by its presence. Merchants moving goods at dawn began their work, knowing that warehouses had been guarded through the night. Officials resting in chambers did so with confidence that their districts remained secure. The patrols were not celebrated, but their invisibility was their success. The seasons brought variation, but never interruption. In spring, blossoms drifted across the road, petals falling onto uniforms as frogs croaked from ponds. In summer, sweat soaked the men as insects swirled relentlessly around the lantern glow. In autumn, cool winds carried the smell of harvested grain and distant fires. Winter brought frost that clung to lashes and boots that crunched on frozen earth, the lantern flames trembling in icy gusts. Each season offered hardship, but none excused absence, for the patrol was constant. Discipline was strict. Soldiers who failed in their duties faced punishment. For to neglect a patrol was to betray not just one's comrades, but the emperor himself. Falling asleep was unthinkable, yet drowsiness was always near, and men devised small methods to remain awake. Some chewed bitter leaves, others hummed softly, and some tapped lantern poles against the road in steady rhythm. The monotony itself became a test of endurance, requiring as much strength as any battle. Families bore the same rhythm. Sons inherited their father's duties under the military household system, bound to service across generations. Wives managed modest homes, patching uniforms, preparing porridge, and waiting for their husband's return at dawn. Children grew up in the shadow of barracks, accustomed to the sight of lanterns disappearing into the night, knowing they too would one day carry them. Advancement was rare, recognition rarer still, but stability was assured. And in the Ming world, stability was valued more than glory. Rarely did events break the silence, but when they did, they were remembered. A thief turned away at a granary, a fire spotted before it spread, a traveler guided safely to a gate. These were small incidents, but they justified the endless hours of uneventful walking. Yet the greatest measure of success was uneventfulness itself, for a quiet night was the highest accomplishment, and a quiet year the greatest triumph. To picture the Ming Dynasty at rest is to picture these men in the background, their lanterns glowing faintly like scattered stars along the empire's roads. They were guardians not of battlefields but of silence, not of victories but of order. Their footsteps were the quiet pulse of the night, their monotony the invisible strength of the state. Forgotten by history, yet vital to their time, they were the unseen keepers of peace, whose constancy allowed millions to sleep without fear. The patrols of the Ming Dynasty reveal a truth about empire that is often forgotten, that great structures of power are held not by moments of glory, but by countless hours of routine carried out by ordinary men. These soldiers were not generals on battlefields or heroes celebrated in story, but rather guardians of silence, whose work was so repetitive and uneventful that it almost disappeared into the background of daily life. Yet it was precisely in this disappearance that their strength lay, for when nothing happened, it meant they had succeeded. A soldier's evening began when the deep beat of the drum echoed from the guardhouse, announcing the changing of the watch. Rising from a straw mat, he tightened his cotton uniform, checked the straps of his belt, and lifted the lantern that would guide him through the night. The lantern's small flame flickered nervously against the wind, yet within its fragile glow rested the authority of the state. It was the mark of order, visible proof that the empire remained vigilant even in darkness. With comrades at his side, he stepped into the night, their shadows stretching long under the pale moonlight. They walked routes that never varied, around granaries where tax grain was stored, past bridges that linked trade routes, and along walls that guarded town gates. At checkpoints, they struck clappers, exchanged tokens, or signed tallies. Each action was recorded, each record preserved, even if no event disturbed the watch. For the Ming bureaucracy, paperwork was proof of vigilance, and proof of vigilance was as important as vigilance itself. To the soldiers, the monotony became a second skin. They walked in silence, speaking little, for words were unnecessary on paths so well known. Their senses tuned to the smallest details: the sound of a shutter closing, the bark of a dog, the hum of insects, the sigh of wind through bamboo. Over time, these sounds became part of their rhythm, familiar companions that reassured them the world remained unchanged. A sudden noise, a broken pattern, was enough to draw their full attention, yet most nights offered no such interruption. The seasons shaped their service but did not excuse it. Spring brought cool air and blossoms that scattered petals underfoot. Summer pressed heavily with heat, sweat soaking through cotton, insects swarming around lantern flames. Autumn carried the sharp scent of harvested grain and wood smoke rising from distant fields. Winter tested them with icy winds, frost biting at their faces, lantern flames trembling in the cold. Through all of it, they walked, for the patrol was unbroken. Discipline was strict. A soldier found neglecting his duty or falling asleep on watch faced harsh punishment. For negligence was not seen as personal failure alone, but as betrayal of the emperor. To avoid such shame, men devised ways to remain alert. Some chewed bitter tea leaves, others tapped their staffs against the ground in steady rhythm, and a few hummed softly under their breath to ward off drowsiness. It was not bravery they needed most, but endurance against monotony. Families bore the same rhythm. Sons inherited their fathers' posts under the military household system, bound across generations. Wives managed modest homes near the barracks, patching uniforms, preparing bowls of rice or millet porridge, and waiting for their husbands to return at dawn. Children grew up watching lanterns vanish into the night, knowing that one day they too would carry them. Advancement was rare, recognition rarer still, but stability was certain, and in the Ming world stability was worth more than glory. Occasionally, small events gave meaning to their endless steps. A thief caught near a warehouse, a barn fire extinguished before it spread, a traveler guided to safety on a dark road. These incidents were minor, yet they were recorded carefully, proof that the patrol mattered. But the greatest measure of success was uneventfulness itself. A night without alarm was victory, a year without trouble the highest triumph. To imagine these patrols now is to see lanterns scattered across the land like faint stars, glowing steadily along roads, walls, and gates. Their footsteps echoed like the heartbeat of the empire, steady, quiet, and unbroken. Though history has forgotten their names, the Ming Dynasty rested on their constancy, on the persistence of men who walked through silence so that millions could sleep undisturbed. Their story is not one of noise but of stillness, not of battles but of repetition, not of glory but of endurance, and in that endurance lay the true strength of the empire. The quiet patrols of the Ming Dynasty reveal how an empire preserved its strength not only through walls, fortresses, and armies, but through the steady persistence of men who walked through the night with lanterns in hand. Their duty was not dramatic, yet it was essential, for the absence of trouble was the greatest success they could achieve. Each soldier learned this truth from the moment he entered service, and his life became measured not in battles, but in footsteps, not in glory, but in repetition. The evening began with the sound of the drum echoing from the guardhouse, a signal as old as the post itself. Soldiers rose from straw mats, tightened their belts, and checked the lanterns that were entrusted to them. Oil was rationed carefully, and wicks adjusted to last the length of the route. The lantern flame flickered nervously, yet its glow was the true badge of authority, more than any weapon. A patrol without lanterns was simply men walking, but with lanterns they became symbols of the emperor's watchful eye, visible proof that order reached even the darkest roads. Walking in pairs or groups of three, they traced routes that circled warehouses, crossed bridges, and followed walls. Each checkpoint was a marker of discipline, and the soldiers announced their presence by clapping wooden boards, striking bells, or leaving tokens. Records were made, tallies marked, and scrolls filled with notes of nights where nothing happened. Though these records were rarely read again, they mattered deeply, for the Ming state valued documentation as the outward sign of order. To the soldiers themselves, the monotony became their world. They walked in silence, speaking little, each man knowing the path so well that words were unnecessary. They learned the shape of every tree along the road, the sound of every dog in every yard, the way shutters creaked in certain houses, the rhythm of frogs in nearby ponds. These details, repeated endlessly, became both comfort and burden. A sudden change, a sound out of place, was enough to sharpen their attention, though usually it proved to be nothing more than wind, animals, or the stirrings of the night. The seasons brought hardship but also marked the passage of time. In spring, they walked through fields heavy with dew, blossoms scattering across the path, petals sticking to damp uniforms. In summer, sweat rolled down their faces, insects swarmed relentlessly, and the heat pressed on their bodies until every step felt heavier. Autumn brought the rustle of harvested grain, the smell of smoke drifting from fields, and cool winds that cut across the roads. Winter was the hardest season, when frost clung to their lashes and boots cracked against frozen earth, the lantern flame trembling against the icy air. Yet none of these conditions excused absence, for the patrol was constant, unbroken by weather or fatigue. Families were tied into the same cycle. Sons inherited their fathers' posts under the military household system, bound across generations. Wives managed modest homes near the barracks, preparing bowls of rice or millet, patching uniforms, and waiting for men to return at dawn. Children grew up in the shadow of barracks, watching lanterns disappear into the night, knowing that one day they too would hold those same fragile lights. Life was narrow but predictable, and in predictability, the empire found its stability. Discipline was strict, for neglect was considered betrayal. A soldier who slept on watch or failed to reach a checkpoint on time risked severe punishment, and the shame could linger longer than the penalty itself. To fight drowsiness, soldiers chewed bitter leaves, tapped staffs against the ground, or hummed softly as they walked. Their challenge was not an enemy to be fought, but monotony itself, and endurance against that monotony was their true test. Rarely, events disturbed the silence. A thief might be caught sneaking near a granary, a fire spotted before spreading, a traveler guided to the proper gate. These incidents were minor, but they proved the necessity of the watch. Yet the highest measure of success remained uneventfulness. A night without incident was a victory. A year without alarm, the greatest triumph. To imagine them now is to see lanterns glowing faintly like scattered stars across the empire's roads, bridges, and walls, moving slowly and steadily under the vast night sky. Their footsteps echoed the quiet heartbeat of the Ming world, steady, unbroken, and unnoticed. Forgotten by history yet vital to their time, they were the silent guardians whose persistence held the empire together, whose monotony became the foundation of peace. The patrols of the Ming Dynasty show us that history is often built not on great events, but on quiet persistence, the kind that leaves no dramatic trace yet supports the whole structure of an empire. Each soldier on patrol accepted that his life would not be remembered, that his name would fade from records, and that his contribution would be measured only in the silence he preserved. Still, this silence was powerful, for without it the empire could not have endured. A patrol began in the same way every evening, with the drumbeat from the guardhouse marking the change of watch. Soldiers stirred from their barracks, adjusted their quilted uniforms, and checked their lanterns. Oil was rationed, wicks trimmed, and flames coaxed into steady light. With these fragile lanterns, the men stepped into the night. Their duty was not to seek enemies, but to be seen, for the presence of their light reassured villagers and deterred trouble. They moved along walls, past warehouses, across bridges, their shadows stretching long under the moonlight, their lanterns glowing like small stars in the darkness. The patrol routes were designed with precision. Every checkpoint had to be reached at the proper time, and signals had to be given to prove that the patrol was complete. Wooden clappers cracked through the silence, whistles carried across empty fields, and tokens were exchanged with watchmen stationed at posts. These actions were noted in ledgers, scrolls filled with details of nights in which nothing occurred. Though the records might seem dull, they were the proof that order was unbroken. The soldiers themselves walked mostly in silence. Conversation was unnecessary on routes so familiar that every step was already known. Instead, they listened to the quiet sounds of the world around them. The creak of wooden shutters, the bark of a distant dog, the steady hum of insects in summer, the rustle of leaves in autumn winds. These sounds reassured them that the night was unchanged. A sudden noise or broken pattern was enough to raise their attention, though it rarely led to danger. The seasons gave rhythm to their lives. Spring nights brought blossoms falling onto their uniforms and the smell of damp soil. Summer was heavy with heat, sweat, and insects drawn to lantern flames. Autumn was marked by sharp winds, the scent of harvested fields, and cool nights that made walking more bearable. Winter tested endurance most of all, with frost on their lashes, boots striking frozen ground, and lantern flames trembling in the cold. Through every season, the patrols continued, for the Empire demanded constancy above all. Families were bound to this life as tightly as the soldiers themselves. Under the military household system, sons inherited their fathers' posts, and entire generations lived by the rhythm of the watch. Wives managed modest homes, patching clothing, preparing food, and raising children who grew up knowing that one day they too would hold the lanterns. Advancement was rare and recognition almost non-existent, but stability was assured. This predictability was the Empire's strength, for it meant that order could be trusted to endure. Discipline was strict. To fall asleep on watch or neglect a checkpoint was to risk harsh punishment, for neglect was considered betrayal of the Emperor's trust. Soldiers found ways to stay awake, chewing bitter leaves, tapping staffs against the road, or humming softly as they walked. Their greatest battle was not against enemies, but against drowsiness and monotony, and their victory was measured in steady footsteps, unbroken through the night. Rare events broke the silence, but only confirmed the patrol's necessity. A thief caught near a granary, a fire extinguished before it spread, a lost traveler guided to safety. Such incidents were small yet important, reminders of why the patrols existed. Still, the true measure of success was uneventfulness. A night without alarm was a triumph. A year without disturbance, the highest achievement. To picture them now is to see lanterns glowing faintly across the land, moving slowly through towns, villages, and roads, glowing like constellations on the earth. Their footsteps were the hidden heartbeat of the Empire, their silence the assurance of peace, their monotony the foundation of stability. They were forgotten men, but their quiet duty carried the weight of a dynasty, proving that sometimes the strength of history lies not in the noise of battle, but in the persistence of those who walked faithfully through the night. The patrols of the Ming Dynasty remind us that the strength of an empire was often maintained not by dramatic clashes, but by the invisible persistence of men who repeated the same tasks across decades. Their duty was not to achieve glory, but to prevent disruption, and the fact that so many nights passed without alarm was proof that they succeeded. To walk the patrol was to live within a cycle where time was measured by drums and bells, by footsteps and lantern light, by the endless rotation of shifts that began again each evening as predictably as the rising of the moon. When the watch changed, the soldiers stirred from their barracks. They tightened their belts, adjusted their quilted uniforms, and lifted lanterns whose flames flickered against the night air. The guardhouse drum echoed heavily, and the men stepped into the roads, their lanterns casting trembling circles of light. The routes they followed were mapped carefully, circling gates, tracing along walls, crossing bridges, and moving around warehouses filled with tax grain. Each checkpoint demanded confirmation of their presence. Sometimes it meant exchanging tokens with a watchman, sometimes striking wooden clappers, sometimes simply appearing at the appointed time. Records of these actions were written in ledgers, stored in offices, and preserved as proof that order had been upheld. Though uneventful, this constant documentation was a hallmark of the Ming state, where bureaucracy valued even the silence of the night as something to be noted. Soldiers endured the monotony with quiet acceptance. They spoke little on patrol, letting the rhythm of their steps guide them. They learned to recognize every detail along the path, the way trees leaned over certain ditches, the barking of dogs in particular courtyards, the creak of shutters in familiar houses, the chirp of crickets in the grass. The night sounds became their companions, repeated so often that they formed an invisible map of reassurance. When something broke the pattern, a noise unfamiliar, a shadow out of place, it drew their attention, though usually it proved harmless. Weather shaped their experience but did not excuse absence. In spring, dew clung to uniforms and blossoms drifted across the road. In summer, sweat soaked their clothing, and insects swarmed relentlessly around lantern flames. Autumn carried the smell of harvested grain and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Winter tested their strength with icy winds, frost gathering on their lashes, and lantern flames trembling in the cold air. Yet the patrols continued without interruption, for the Empire demanded constancy above comfort. Families bore this rhythm too. Sons inherited their fathers' roles under the military household system, bound across generations to the same duty. Wives kept homes near the posts, preparing food, repairing clothing, and raising children who would one day walk the same roads. Advancement was rare, but stability was certain, and the predictability of life was valued as much as loyalty itself. Occasionally, events disrupted the silence. A thief might be stopped at a warehouse, a fire extinguished before it spread, or a traveler guided to safety in the night. These incidents were minor, yet they were recorded carefully and remembered as proof of the patrol's necessity. Still, the true measure of success lay not in these rare moments of action, but in the countless nights when nothing happened. For a patrol to return without incident was to know that peace had been preserved, that villagers had slept undisturbed, that the Empire had remained steady. To imagine the patrols now is to see lanterns glowing faintly like stars scattered across the land, moving slowly through towns, roads, and fields under the vast night sky. Their footsteps echoed the quiet heartbeat of the Empire, steady, unbroken, unnoticed. They were guardians of stillness, protectors of silence, keepers of uneventful hours, and though history has not preserved their names, the Ming Dynasty rested on their persistence. In their monotony lay strength, and in their silence lay the foundation of order. The long chain of Ming Dynasty patrols stretched across centuries like an unbroken thread, weaving through villages, towns, and cities, binding the Empire together with footsteps and lantern light. Each soldier who stepped into the night knew that his duty was not to seek adventure, but to preserve the quiet. And in that quiet lay the greatest success. The watch began with the drumbeat from the guardhouse, a sound that rolled through the barracks and stirred men from their mats. They adjusted belts, tied sashes, and lifted lanterns prepared with carefully measured oil. The flame trembled inside its paper casing, fragile yet steady, the true emblem of their authority. With lanterns glowing, the men walked out into the night, their shadows stretching long across walls and dirt roads. The patrol routes were fixed, circling granaries, passing through gates, tracing bridges, and stopping at checkpoints where presence had to be confirmed. Sometimes wooden clappers cracked through the silence. Sometimes whistles pierced the dark. Sometimes tokens were exchanged with watchmen waiting at their posts. Each action was written into ledgers, scrolls that filled offices with records of uneventful nights. Though such paperwork might appear dull, it was proof that order held. To the soldiers, silence was the measure of success, and monotony was the heart of their duty. They walked in pairs or trios, their steps unhurried, their words few. The world around them was filled with familiar sounds: the bark of dogs, the croak of frogs in fields, the hum of cicadas in summer, the rustle of autumn leaves, the faint creak of shutters in village homes. These small noises became their companions, and any break in the pattern was enough to sharpen attention. Yet most of the time, the night passed as it always had, without alarm. Weather shaped their experience, bringing hardship but never reprieve. Spring covered the roads with blossoms, petals scattering beneath boots damp with dew. Summer brought heavy heat, sweat-soaking uniforms, insects circling endlessly around the lantern glow. Autumn sharpened the air, leaves crunched softly, and smoke from harvest fires drifted on the wind. Winter tested endurance with biting cold, boots cracking on frozen earth, lantern flames trembling in icy gusts. Yet through every season the patrols moved on, steady and constant, unbroken by the elements. Families lived within the same rhythm. Sons inherited the posts of fathers under the military household system, bound to service across generations. Wives managed modest homes near the barracks, preparing porridge, patching clothing, and waiting for men to return at dawn. children grew up watching lanterns vanish into the dark, knowing that one day they would carry them too. Advancement was rare, recognition rarer still, but stability was assured, and stability was the highest virtue in the Ming world. Rare incidents broke the monotony and were remembered. A thief caught near a warehouse, a fire spotted in time to be extinguished, a traveler guided safely through the night. Small events that confirmed the necessity of endless, uneventful hours. But the true purpose of the patrol was prevention, and prevention left no trace. To return with nothing to report was the greatest accomplishment, for it meant that peace had prevailed. To picture the empire at rest is to imagine these men in the background, lanterns glowing faintly like scattered stars, footsteps marking the hours, silence stretching between drumbeats. They were the invisible heartbeat of the night, the unnoticed strength of the state. Though history has not preserved their names, their constancy held the empire together. Their monotony became the framework of order, and their silence carried the weight of peace. In their endless repetition lay the endurance of the Ming Dynasty, proof that sometimes the most powerful guardians are not those who fight, but those who walk patiently through the dark, keeping watch when the world sleeps. As we arrive at the closing reflection on the quiet patrols of the Ming Dynasty, it is important to recognize that their legacy was never meant to be loud or glorious, but rather silent and steady. These soldiers were not remembered for dramatic battles, nor did their names enter the great chronicles of history, but their contribution was felt every night in the peace they preserved. A soldier in the 15th century would have walked the same path as one in the 17th, repeating the same gestures with the same care. He rose at the sound of the drum, adjusted his quilted uniform, tightened the belt at his waist, and lifted his lantern from its hook. The flame was coaxed to life, trembling behind its paper casing, and with that fragile light he stepped into the night. The patrol moved along fixed routes, circling warehouses filled with tax grain, passing gates bolted shut, and tracing walls that guarded the edges of towns. At each checkpoint, they made their presence known with clappers, whistles, or tokens. Watchmen recorded their arrival, and officials stored the reports in ledgers that filled dusty offices. These records, dull to read, were proof that order had been upheld. A night without incident was celebrated not with noise but with silence, for silence meant success. The soldiers themselves walked in pairs or small groups, their words few, their steps slow and steady. They learned the rhythm of the night so well that it became part of them. They recognized the bark of familiar dogs, the creak of shutters in known houses, the chorus of frogs in the fields, the hiss of wind through bamboo groves. These sounds, repeated endlessly, were companions on their long walks. When something broke the pattern, it drew their attention. But most of the time, the night passed without change, uneventful and calm. Seasons added their own texture to the monotony. Spring brought dew-soaked roads and drifting blossoms. Summer pressed heavily with heat, sweat, and insects swarming around lantern flames. Autumn cooled the air, carrying the smell of harvested grain and smoke from distant fires. Winter tested the body with frost that clung to lashes and boots cracking on frozen ground, the lantern light trembling against the icy wind. Yet through every season, the patrols continued, constant and unbroken. Families lived with the same rhythm. Sons inherited the duties of fathers under the military household system. Wives kept homes near the posts, and children grew up watching lanterns vanish into the darkness, knowing they would one day carry them. Advancement was rare, recognition rarer still, but stability was certain. And stability was the greatest gift the patrols provided to the empire. Occasionally, small events reminded them of their purpose. A thief turned away from a granary, a fire spotted before spreading, a traveler guided safely at night. These were rare, but they justified the countless uneventful hours. Yet the true value of the patrol lay in prevention, in ensuring that nothing happened at all. To return with nothing to report was the highest form of accomplishment, for it meant peace had prevailed. To imagine the Ming Dynasty at rest is to see lanterns glowing faintly across the land, scattered like stars along roads, bridges, and gates. Their footsteps were the hidden heartbeat of the empire, their silence its invisible strength. They were guardians of uneventful nights, keepers of stillness, protectors of order through monotony. Though history has not preserved their names, their quiet persistence carried the weight of a dynasty. In their endless repetition lay the endurance of the state, proof that sometimes the greatest power rests not in noise or battle, but in the steady footsteps of those who keep watch when the world sleeps. The quiet patrols of the Ming Dynasty were forgotten men, yet their constancy was the foundation of peace. And their legacy remains a reminder that stability is often built not on grand moments, but on the silent persistence of ordinary duty. Before we end tonight's story, here is a gentle reminder just for you. Try not to eat too much right before bed, as a light stomach helps you drift into deeper sleep. Put your phone aside for a while, let your mind rest from the brightness of screens, and allow yourself a few quiet breaths. Sleep comes easiest when the body is calm and the heart is unburdened. Thank you for spending this time with us. Sweet dreams, may your night be peaceful, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening here at Sleep Whisper.